Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're just waiting on a few more people to join in and we'll get started shortly. Thank you for joining. We're just going to get started in a few minutes. Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Nahid Khan, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at the Immigrant Women's Information Network. On behalf of the IWIN team and staff, welcome to today's webinar, Advancing Justice Together, Role of Immigrant Women and Indigenous Solidarity. IWIN is a membership-driven organization representing immigrant women. We envision a society where immigrant women, trans women, non-binary, gender diverse, and two-spirit people experience full gender and racial equality. Our work takes place on the traditional territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Many of you are joining from different territories, each with its own histories, treaties, and responsibilities. As a feminist social justice group serving immigrant women, IWIN is committed to understanding the past and ongoing consequences of colonialism, especially its impact on Indigenous women. We also acknowledge the lasting effects of harmful narratives that continue to shape how immigrants, refugees, and newcomers understand Indigenous peoples and their histories. Today, we discuss the role of immigrant women in advancing Indigenous solidarity. We reflect on the divisions that have been created between our communities and the importance of building relationships based on truth, accountability, and justice. We reaffirm our solidarity to our Indigenous sisters across Turtle Island in their pursuit of truth, reconciliation, and gender and racial justice. At IWIN, we are committed to creating spaces that center Indigenous voices, histories, and perspectives while fostering solidarity between Indigenous and immigrant women. I am so pleased to introduce our speakers for today's webinar, Dr. Chizuru Nobe Galani. Dr. Chizuru, a racialized migrant settler from rural Japan, has a background in social work focused on health and well-being for marginalized communities, both locally and internationally. Her research is centered on the politics and policies pertaining to migrant communities, particularly regarding the colonial and racial politics of Canadian citizenship, historical and contemporary immigration, refugee and citizenship policies, social and structural determinants of migrant health, and Indigenous migrant relations. We also will be having Dr. Yukiko Tanaka joining us today as a speaker. Dr. Yukiko Tanaka is currently an assistant professor teaching stream at the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. Her research uses ethnographic data to advance our understanding of relationships between racialization, migration, and settler colonialism. She's particularly interested in the ways migrants of color use anti-Indigenous narratives to claim belonging in a settler state, and conversely, in the conditions under which migrants enact solidarity with Indigenous people on the basis of shared experiences of racialization and colonization. As each presentation is being delivered, we kindly ask all attendees to type your questions in the Q&A box. We will spend the first 15 minutes addressing your questions during the Q&A sessions. Dr. Chizuru, we now invite you to present. We will turn the presentation over to you. Welcome.
Hello, thank you so much. So as the introduction said, my name is Chizuru Nobegalani. My pronouns are Shin and Har. It's my pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank the Immigrant Women Information Network for the invitation. And I also want to thank the land I'm on. So today I'm calling in from the Toronto, traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Wendat, and now home to many First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, and then Treaty Holder Mississauga of Credit First Nation. I also want to acknowledge many other Indigenous people and communities who have deep histories with these lands, but cannot be captured with these lines of land acknowledgement. I'm very grateful for these lands that I and my family have lived and worked, not only for the beauty and substance that they offer to sustain our lives, but also the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities who have taken care of these lands. Next slide, please. So before I get into the topic for today, I want to briefly situate myself. It's mentioned, I'm a migrant settler from rural Japan. You see on the top left corner of the picture of the rice paddies where I grew up. And I was raised by my maternal grandmother, we call it Bachan, whom you see in the top right corner. She's incredibly sweet and cute. She passed on now, but she lived up until 101. And I moved to Settler, Canada over 20 years ago to pursue my post-secondary education. I worked in the newcomer serving sector for over a decade, both as a frontline worker and a manager. You see the picture on the left corner. I love working with communities, and I continue my engagement with migrants community through my community engaged research. In addition, my work with migrants communities, I'm also an active member of urban agriculture and in community gardens in Toronto. I learned the importance of taking care of the land from my grandmother, my garden teachers, Indigenous elders, and chickens that you see on the right bottom corner. Next slide, please. So I share a bit of myself to signal the importance of thinking through my migration trajectory and settler subjectivity on the Turtle Island. Potawatomi Lenape scholar Susan Dion states that the work of unpacking a settlerhood requires to consider the land I came from as much as the land that I came to. In one way or the other, my scholarship has always been about making sense of what it means to make home on a stolen land. So today's talk is based on my scholarly work on the critical citizenship and the Indigenous and migrant relationality. I try, although the time is quite limited, I'll try to cover 3 key points. Firstly, I will offer the critique of Canadian citizenship, focusing on its function as a settler citizen-making project. Secondly, I'll speak about settler responsibility, thinking about how we are all treaty people. And then finally, if the time allows, I will touch on an example of Indigenous and migrant relationship building. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce the concept of perfect stranger by the Potawatomi Lenape scholar Susan Dion. Dion speaks about how newcomers to Canada had become a perfect stranger in which they were trained to distance themselves from Indigenous issues through the settlement and integration processes. So indeed, settler colonialism has historically and contemporarily functioned to divide Indigenous and migrant community, pitting them against each other. Though things are changing, it is quite common still for newcomers to know nothing about Indigenous presence or colonial histories of Canada. Most newcomer services are not designed to uplift the Indigenous presence or their knowledges. And this is intentional on the part of settler colonial Canada. For this reason, I see the great need to center settler colonialism in thinking through Indigenous and migrant relationality. The next point, next slide, please. Okay, so before I go on, I want to pose a few questions to you, which you can perhaps respond in the chat. The first question is, what are some ideas do you hold about Canadian citizenship? Second, what does a good citizen mean to you? And finally, what are some activities do you have to encourage settlement and integration at your organization? I'll take a few minutes, not a few minutes, that might be too long, like a minute or so for you to respond to these line of questions. I'm just gonna open my chat to see if I see any. So I'm not seeing any being typed up. Perhaps what you could do is kind of think through these questions as you listen to some of the things I'm going to share right now. Next slide, please. Okay. So in my research, I have looked at how the newcomer serving sector has become a site of settler citizen making as a part of broader settler nation building project. So there are various intersecting discourses at play, shaping the work with the newcomer serving newcomers, and they often work in a very subtle and complicated ways. Today, I don't really have enough time to get into the details of each discourse, but I would like to briefly speak about them for your consideration. So the first key discourse at play in the newcomer service sector is a white civility. Daniel Coleman explains white civility as an idea that certain behaviors, manners, and cultural norms are often considered proper or civilized, but these standards are largely shaped by white supremacy. Put it another way, it's the expectation that everyone should act according to social rules and standards set by white settlers, which often means BIPOC communities are judged against these standards. In newcomer serving sector, these social rules and standards become the reference point in which the success of our services are measured. In addition, our work with newcomers is undoubtedly shaped by the discourse of neoliberalism. We all know the overt way in which neoliberalism shapes our work. The emphasis on efficiency, centralized reporting system does not capture the nuance of our work, funding cuts resulting from corporate interests over social welfare. But neoliberalism also works in a more subtle ways. For example, the way in which we may equate their worthiness, our clients' worthiness, with their hard work, or their success to be a product citizen who can contribute to Canadian economy. Further complicated, our work with newcomers is also shaped by the discourse of humanitarianism, particularly when it comes to the work with refugee settlement. When Canada accepts refugee under the name of humanitarianism, it raises Canada's international profile and reputation, positioning itself as a savior. The newcomer serving sector reproduced this humanitarian discourse. For example, when we pledged for Canada's generosity and its humanitarian reputation in our advocacy letters to grant refugee client immigration status, or when our refugee clients repeat their gratitude and embeddedness with phrases such as, Canada saved me and my family, I thank Canada for welcoming me. When we enact this Canadian humanitarianism discourse in everyday practice and construct Canada as a savior, it becomes difficult to imagine the violent histories and colonial practices that continue today against First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. And then finally, I also want to point another key discourse at play in the newcomer serving sector, what Alcott Kopp had called transnational whiteness. In the context of the newcomer serving sector, transnational whiteness is manifested in the way in which migrants, myself also included, often hold a particular image of Canada, beautiful, peaceful, democratic, and prosperous, prior to arriving in country. Alakok speaks about how whiteness has been transported and reconfigured via historical and local relations of power and has become part of the social identity that informs the worldview and politics in non-European and non-white context. This has created a mystic image of Canada as a good and democratic country that attracts immigrants and welcome immigrants while displacing the original inhabitant, Indigenous people, outside the imagined civilized land. So while these discourses I speak about now are not exhaustive, and there are many other discourses at play, but they do operate to make the newcomer serving sector as contested site where racial and settler colonial scripts of Canadian citizenship are reproduced and practiced. Next slide, please. So now we need to ask ourselves, what is our responsibility in all of this? So if our work with newcomer have been implicated in a settler colonial project, in what ways we can disrupt this mechanism? And for this, I want us to turn to Harsha Walia's work on settler responsibility. Walia speaks about settler responsibility as understanding ourselves as complicit within settler colonialism, taking up the responsibilities to educate our communities about Indigenous histories on the land that we reside on, prioritizing active support for Indigenous self-determinations, and then finally, steering away from seeking greater recognition from a colonial system and going beyond the demanding citizenship rights from the settler states. Next slide, please. So drawing on Walia, I would like to suggest a few points in the context of newcomer serving sector. So settlers, including newcomers, needs to be actively engaged in a work of truth and reconciliation. We need to take the key message of 2015 TRC Calls to Action report seriously, which states we are all treaty people. Second, it is not the responsibility of Indigenous people to educate settlers. While it is a great honor to receive the teaching from Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, we need to do our part in educating ourselves, especially now that there are lots of resources that we can turn to. Next, related to the second point, oh, sorry, not the next slide, just the next point. Thank you. So related to the second point, we must focus on the idea of truth before reconciliation. So we cannot start working on reconciliation without unveiling the truth that founded what the Canada is today. So what does all of that look like in the practice of newcomer services? Next slide, please. So I want to share a bit about a project that addressed this line of question. So from 2020 to 2022, I conducted a community action project entitled Renewing a Relationship with Local Lands, Exploration of Indigenous and Refugee Relation with the Canadian Center for Victims of Torture. So the project asked, what does a refugee integration look like when local Indigenous history, presence, and knowledge are considered, focusing on the land histories and learning in the context of Toronto. Next slide, please. So we are really fortunate to engage with Cayuga Elder Norma Jacobs from the Six Nations Grand River and my mentor, Dr. Timothy Leduc, who worked for Lowell University in this project. The project involved 5 virtual learning and reflection circles, which were co-facilitated by Elder Norma, Dr. Leduc, and myself, and it involved the CCVD clients and staff members. Next slide, please. So I just want to, I guess, share a bit of little information of what we actually did. So we covered these topics. First one was Thanksgiving address, and then traditional Haudenosaunee welcoming of people from other lands. To rural and Indigenous Toronto, intent and colonial breaking. Then we moved on to the topic of colonial history, residential school, modern and missing Indigenous women and girls. And then we had a teaching about plant medicine, the naturalizing land relations. And then final virtual session was on setting our intentions and values. And when the COVID restriction shifted and it seemed quite okay to meet in person, we had an in-person session at the High Park in May 2022. Next slide, please. So I don't really have time to speak about findings of this project and some of the nuances that came out from this project, but I can tell a little bit about what happened and is happening at CCVT. So CCVT firstly took TRC as a key part of a strategic plan, made sure that all their activities have the TRC in mind as they plan their newcomer service programming. They're also conducting ongoing professional development regarding settler colonialism and settler responsibilities. They have also revised the land acknowledgement, personalizing to their work. They also translated their land acknowledgement in multiple languages, I believe into 7 different languages, which I thought that was quite beneficial for the clients. And they also study newcomer youth for truth and reconciliation, focusing on climate change and climate justice. And then finally, they are making efforts to include Indigenous content, English classes, and support groups. Next slide, please. Okay. So I think this is going to be final slide, and I'm very excited to speak about this. So there is an incredible initiative that is happening, which is called the National Newcomer Collective for Truth and Reconciliation. So this collectively emerged out of the desire to work collectively with other newcomer serving organizations who are similarly working towards TRC coastal action. So we, throughout the work that we are doing, we have realized that many organizations are doing really important and amazing work. So we wanted to create a space for collective reflection, learning, and critical action, because I think everyone is very much eager to do this work, but haven't had the chance to really think through together. So like what we wanted to do is to kind of create a space that everyone can come together and then ask even like a simple question, like how do we go about, approaching Indigenous communities and things like that? And then what are the risks of doing things like that? So now we have a simple and very humble website at nnctr.ca. And you can find some resources that we have collected so far, and more will be added. Just as a note, like website is really work in progress because everyone is kind of doing this work on the side of their table kind of situation. But if you have any resources that you have and you want them to be added, please reach out to us. We're also looking for new members always, including advisory committee, particularly from different provinces. And finally, we are very happy to share that CCVT has received funding to expand the work of collective. So I think there will be more exciting projects that will be happening regarding Indigenous and migrant relationship building in the sector. I think I'm going to end here and then pass it on to my fellow speaker, Dr. Yukiko. And I have admired Dr. Yukiko's work and look forward to hearing their talk now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chizuru, for that insightful presentation. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Yukiko to share your screen as we transition the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Nahid. Can you see everyone see my screen? Okay, perfect. Thanks so much to Iwan for inviting me to be here, and thank you to Dr. Chizuru for your amazing presentation. I learned so much, and I'm really looking forward to continuing a conversation with you. So hopefully my presentation will follow up on some of Dr. Chizuru's points. So I also wanted to begin my presentation with using a land acknowledgement to discuss how I came to this research. So Toronto, where I live and work, and where Iwan is based, I believe, is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And the site of my research and the place where I grew up, Saskatoon, is on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Saulteaux peoples. I've been really privileged to call both Toronto and Saskatoon home. And on a personal level, I've long been invested in unpacking what it means for immigrants like me and my family to be treaty people and to make a home on stolen Indigenous land. I came to Canada when I was 3 years old, and growing up in a place like Saskatoon, where there is a large Indigenous population, and when I was growing up, a small but now growing immigrant population, I came to a political commitment to building solidarity between our communities. Before I went to graduate school, I also worked at a settlement agency, and I wanted to continue exploring that settlement work more through my graduate studies because I really respect and admire the hard work that people are doing on the ground every day. So today I'd like to share some of the findings from my research on newcomer Indigenous solidarity, which are lessons from my work with the immigrant serving sector in Saskatoon, but I believe it can resonate for service providers and advocates across Canada as well. So I'll start off with some theoretical context for my project. So I take settler colonialism as a structure that is differentiated from other forms of colonialism through the drive to permanently settle and take over land. This structure continually shifts in order to dispossess Indigenous nations in the present. And one of those shifts since the 1970s is that these permanent settlers now come primarily from non-European countries. So I identify three ways that Indigenous people and immigrants are connected under the structure of settler colonialism, showing the potentials for solidarity. So first, contemporary immigrants often leave their home countries due to conditions that are a legacy of Western European colonialism abroad, uniting Indigenous people and immigrants in shared struggle against colonialism. Second, immigrants and Indigenous people are both excluded from belonging in the national community. Full membership or citizenship continues to be reserved for white settlers. And third, these groups are connected but differentially positioned in relation to land and labor. Indigenous peoples have been dispossessed from their land via the formation and expansion of Canada, while immigrant labor has been exploited to generate wealth from that land. So we might expect Indigenous folks and immigrants to have aligned interests because of these factors. They're both from formerly colonizations, and they both experience higher than average unemployment and poverty. But of course, a theoretical solidarity does not always translate easily into a praxis of solidarity. And despite these similarities and connections that newcomers and Indigenous folks have, there are also important and crucial differences between the groups. So in my research, I take a critical look at how this solidarity can be fostered in settlement agencies. So the research questions that I address through this research project and more broadly are, what are the possibilities and limitations of solidarity between newcomers and Indigenous people in the process of immigrant settlement? And how are these possibilities mediated through immigrant settlement agencies? So I'll give you some background context on Saskatoon in case you're not familiar. So by the 2021 census, Saskatoon's population was about 260,000, including 11.5% Indigenous and 20.4% immigrant, with 6.4% being recent immigrants who had arrived within the past 5 years. Saskatoon looks very different now from when I was growing up there. My research draws on fieldwork in the immigrant newcomer sector, including the Immigrant Newcomer Training Program, which is a federally funded program that brings together Indigenous and immigrant youth ages 18 to 30 in a combination of work readiness and interculturalism skill building. So in the program, there's workshops on resume writing, job interviews, workplace culture, life skills, like the regular expected things that a lot of settlement agencies do for employment training. But they combine it with education on Indigenous cultures and histories. All of the individual and organization names that I'm using here are pseudonyms to protect my participants' confidentiality. I'll tell you a bit about what I did through the research. So I did 15 weeks of full-time participant observation over 3 program cohorts with the program I call INTP from 2018 to 2019, plus informal engagement with the community over that year and a half. I also did interviews with 22 individuals involved in INTP or with the broader immigrant serving community in Saskatoon. And so you can see a table summarizing my interview participants on the screen. And then I also did sharing circles with 21 youth, following protocols including sharing food, offering the option to smudge, and gifting tobacco and paper cranes to each participant as a gesture towards each of our cultures. So I want to note that as a second generation, and I also have a table summarizing the sharing circles here. So I want to note that as a second generation immigrant who grew up in Saskatoon, I had similarities with both the Indigenous and immigrant participants in some ways, but I was vastly more privileged in others. So I don't want to assume that I would automatically have more rapport with the immigrants because I'm a child of immigrants, but I do take seriously the ways that my positionality may have affected my data collection. I'll summarize my findings briefly here and then get more deeply into them. So I'm dividing this into 3 sections. First, why indigenize? Participants told me that they're indigenizing for 2 reasons. First, acknowledging First Peoples as an ethical commitment, and second, to combating racism in the newcomer community. Then what does indigenization look like on the ground? Folks in the Saskatoon sector are building client-facing relationships, they're building relationships, and they're building internal change in their organization. And then some of the challenges in this process of indigenization include funding, the overburdening of Indigenous staff, incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing, and the attitudes of newcomers themselves. So first, why indigenize? I find that all of the interviewees emphatically expressed that acknowledging First Peoples is an incredibly important moral and ethical responsibility for immigrant organizations to recognize Indigenous communities as the original inhabitants of the land. So Safi, one of the frontline workers who is also an Indigenous woman, told me, settlement agencies are working on Treaty 6 territory, and if they can't have an acknowledgement of that and the role that that should play within their organization, then they're doing a disservice to not this country, but kind of this country. If you don't have Indigenous content or something in some way in your organization, then you're segregating an entire population. And in Saskatchewan, that's a huge population to push aside. So, in Safi's words, to be a good treaty partner, immigrant organizations must bring Indigenous content into their programming. And she sees this as mutually beneficial, not just for immigrant or Indigenous communities on their own, but for the entire province. A second, more pragmatic reason to indigenize settlement is to help counteract racist attitudes among immigrants. Newcomers would freely repeat negative stereotypes about Indigenous people. So, as Christina, a current manager at an organization and a former frontline worker, put it, I recognize that in as little as 2 weeks, newcomers would come to my class and have already learned negative stereotypes about Indigenous communities, and quite strong, not just, oh, I thought I heard this. No, like intensely so, like this is the way it is, learned misinformation. So these organizations thought that it was incredibly important to help combat those attitudes. So there's main ways that I find immigrant organizations working to indigenize. First, making internal change, including board and staff training, hiring more Indigenous staff, and making changes to internal policy and organization, vision, and mission. The second way is through client-facing events and programming to address the racism within the newcomer community. Organizations are working on changing curriculums in employment and language programs to reflect up-to-date information about Indigenous people. They also organized multicultural events where people had the opportunity to share cultural practices. So Amir, a leader of a settlement agency, says, we see people enjoy and celebrate and have those kind of aha moments, kind of like saying, oh, I didn't realize we have a lot of similarities. So it's just like trying to fill those gaps. And I think people get along because it's just stereotypes, and these things increase the gap or the differences that these people have. And then you have a broken down community if you don't do that work. So Amir's reference to a broken down community echoes Safi's earlier statement. Without indigenization work, the entire community is negatively impacted. So other respondents expressed some doubt about the long-term impact of such programming, especially when it comes to one-time events that focuses on folkloric displays of culture. So while public education events are really useful to some extent, they don't get at the relationship building aspect, which I discuss next. So respondents highlighted the need for relationship building between Indigenous and immigrant communities. They told me that only doing that internal work or that client-facing work leaves indigenization incomplete. They emphasize the need for authentic or genuine relationships that avoid tokenization and involve long-lasting partnerships. So Naomi from the city of Saskatoon said, you keep coming back to the elders, to the survivors, to those stories, because that's why we're doing the work, right? We've built relationships and I trust them and I trust their judgment, you know? So a lot of that informs the work that I do and how I do my work. So because of the importance of genuine or authentic relationship building, my respondents often noted that change is quite slow and incremental. And this slowness is felt acutely by some of the Indigenous folks who are working in the settlement space. So four major challenges to indigenization. First, this is one that you all probably know, limitations of funding loomed really large in my conversations with people especially in managerial and board roles. So Jack, a board member of an organization, told me part of the challenge in this area of bridging between newcomers and Indigenous people and all that that entails is that there's not a lot of funding out there for it. I mean, IRCC, it says, our job is settlement. We don't fund that kind of thing. That's not really our job. So interviewees pointed to the importance of institutionalizing indigenization in policy due to the contingency of funding. Another challenge is in unsafe working conditions for Indigenous colleagues. So Wapus, a Indigenous frontline worker, recounted his experience giving a presentation to school-aged children at one of the settlement agencies. I had a little girl from Bangladesh, I believe, say, my mom said I can't be friends with you because you're drunk and you're going to steal from me. And it broke my heart. I really had to collect myself in the moment and tell myself to breathe because I could feel myself starting to tear up, and I could feel a lump in my throat. So after this experience, Wapis wrote a letter to senior staff at the organization, sharing the story and asking them to make a change. And leadership, while sympathetic, tasked him with reviewing the Indigenous content in the organization's curriculum and making a presentation for all of the instructors on the revised content. So in this case, Indigenous staff are the most directly affected by these attitudes from clients, but they're also expected to be the most active in changing the situation. And while newcomer organizations have embraced the TRC calls to action, they have not necessarily embraced Indigenous ways of knowing. And this is a problem because it forces Indigenous peoples to fit into colonial norms rather than trying to reshape the structure of newcomer organizations. So Sally, an Indigenous woman who works for the city of Saskatoon, says, I think actually having more Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge systems and people within them would broaden the scope of Indigenous influence in being able to change the way things are done. I think the process of decolonization too is being more welcoming to newcomers and new people to Canada, because that's what we've always been as Indigenous people. We've always been very welcoming. It's just we didn't want to give it all away and, be dispossessed of our land and resources. But the idea really was to share the land and resources for everyone's benefit and prosperity. And the final challenge is getting buy-in from newcomers. So even when settlement agencies implement Indigenous education, like INTP did, it doesn't automatically mean that newcomers are interested and willing to hear these messages. So as Kareem, a former staff and current manager, puts it, why should they care about what happened? And I've heard this, he's quoting the participants here, in the past. Many countries suffer through colonialism. What's so special? So, how do you get these people to care? How do you get them to have some sort of responsibility, self promoting responsibility to improve this, to inform people, or at the very least, not keep promoting the stereotypes? Um, so, I want to wrap up by presenting some of the different responses from newcomers that went through INTP. So we might expect that after such an intensive program, newcomers would expect changed attitudes, and more solidarity with Indigenous peoples, but that's not always the case. Um, so some of them expressed increased awareness of Indigenous histories and their present realities and realized that they had similarities. So, for example, Fred from Nigeria says, I think in more ways than one, we are quite similar. I mean, First Nations people and immigrants, we probably have been dealt the same hands because employers and the government don't even see us any differently. But despite the efforts of the settlement agency, immigrants often expressed resentment towards Indigenous people for refusing to get over colonialism. They spoke to this kind of neoliberal attitude and said that they needed to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So, for example, Fatima, a Somalian refugee, says, my people were enslaved. My people were deprived of their land. This is what happened to them. But yet again, I'm here. I'm alive today and I'm grateful for that. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to get to a better place. I know that the government is being totally unfair to Indigenous people, and that's a really bad thing. But then again, they shouldn't dwell on what happened. So this suggests that settlement agencies face long-term challenges in getting newcomers to care about Indigenous issues. I'll leave off on a hopeful note towards solidarity, that building solidarity is possible, but it's not automatic. So this education is only the first step. Jason, a participant from the Philippines, says the Philippines is a product of colonization. It's already been colonized, so they're never going to get their real roots back. But here, the Indigenous people are really fighting to still have their real culture and to not lose their traditions, you know? And I agree with that. Fight. Fight for your culture. Like when you lose that, that sucks because you don't know what you are. You lose your sense of self. Like, who am I? What am I? Where am I really from? I know I'm running low on time, but I will leave off on a couple of recommendations. Incorporating Indigenous knowledges into organizational practices and policies, sharing expertise in the newcomer sector with Indigenous communities, building Indigenization through practices that are specific to the local community, ensuring that all staff have training and professional development opportunities to further their own and their clients' knowledge about Indigenous issues, recognize that addressing anti-Indigenous racism in the newcomer communities is a responsibility of the entire sector, institutionalizing Indigenization to protect these ideas from staff turnover and funding contingencies, paying attention to not only similarities between newcomers and Indigenous peoples, but also the specificity of settler colonialism, and going towards education towards acts of solidarity. My final recommendation for funders is to make sustainable, long-term, stable funding available to the settlement sector for engaging in reconciliation and Indigenization work. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Yukiko, for your thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. So we're right on time. We're going to begin our Q&A session, where I will share some of the questions submitted by attendees with our speakers. If you hadn't had the chance yet, please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll hopefully be able to answer it in today's webinar. So I have the first question here. Are there any Indigenous-led groups or networks where immigrant women can contribute to advancing Indigenous justice and solidarity? Dr. Chizuru, Dr. Yukiko, I leave the floor open to you if you'd like to answer it.
Go ahead, Dr. Chizuru.
I was going to say it will, I think there are many Indigenous-led organizations or groups all across. I personally am a big advocate for local level relationship building. Having said that, like I think what I personally do myself is try to find that that speaks to you. So for example, like, you know, for me, grass narrow communities, the effect of ecological violation really speaks to me. So I'll try to show up for that kind of organizations. But there is many Indigenous-led groups and networks all across Turtle Island.
That's right along the lines of what I was going to say, which is that it's important to build genuine and authentic relationships with the folks in your local communities. So I would also recommend just showing up at events, showing up at public, publicly advertised things that you're interested in, and chatting with people and building relationships from there.
Thank you for both of your responses. I'm going to move on to the next question. We have another question here in the Q&A box. I have been seeking to become a part of an Indigenous community near where I live in the east of Toronto, Ajax. I'm wondering how to go about finding a community and steps that must be taken on my part.
Um, I'm not going to give like a specific suggestion, but I think I'm going to kind of recapitulate the points that I was making before in the first question about the necessity of finding your own interest. And I think like following groups on social media is helpful. I walk around looking for flyers for different events. And I find that whenever I go to an event, people are really willing to talk and to share. So I think that's how I would answer that question. Sorry if it's not more specific, but I think it is so important to build those genuine relationships.
And I think I want to add too that the Dr. Yukiko spoke about like how the relationship takes time. So that's another thing is like, you know, you approach a particular community, like could be a community organization or group, or it could be like my favorite place to look for that kind of relationship is actually at the gardens. And sometimes there is like an Indigenous like gardens, and I will try to show up and support what they're doing. But they might not welcome you right away because like it's not on them to welcome us to, you know, so I think we have to be quite committed and consistent in showing up of what might be needed of you.
Thank you, Dr. Chizuru and Dr. Yukiko. I have another question in the Q&A box. Have you encountered workplace environments where advocacy for specific groups or causes is restricted, with the focus limited to internal support only? If so, how would you navigate these boundaries while still fostering meaningful progress for reconciliation and diversity, equity, and inclusivity?
Sorry, can you put the questions back? Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Um, so I'm not sure if I'm reading this question correctly, but the focus is limited to internal support for employees of the organization rather than advocacy, like Indigenous advocacy if there are no Indigenous employees. Um, I guess I would say that we can draw, I think we can draw on the TRC calls to action that call on all sectors in Canada to participate in this reconciliation work. And if we take, for this sector, there's the calls 93 and 94. But if we take seriously the kinds of education work that settlement agencies are doing, then all the education related calls to action are also applicable to us. And therefore, we can, I think, there's a possibility for advocacy saying that there is a mandate to do this kind of work, no matter what kind of organization we're working in. Um, so I don't have direct experience with that kind of situation because, especially in Saskatoon, given that the problem of anti-Indigenous racism is so real and prevalent and in your face every day, that I think it's hard to push that aside. But I would suggest taking seriously those calls to action and the responsibility that all organizations have to respond.
Mm, Yeah, and I think I also add like the buying from management and boards are quite critical, that's for sure. So it might just mean that there might need some bit more of internal advocacy within organizations, which ideally will lead to change in attitude or mindset. Having said that too, I think there are some existing discourses, like so diversity, equity, and inclusion is something quite like these days in general. It's been challenged with the Trump, but like like that kind of discourse is quite formalized. So you could tap into that too for the internal, I guess, advocacy, which hopefully leads to I guess, the willingness to do more advocacy outside of the organization.
Thank you, Dr. Yukiko and Dr. Sarah, for your response. We actually have a question in the chat box. I'll go ahead and read it. From my experience with working with the Indigenous community can be quite closed off, understandably so, due to the trauma they faced from the past. Some Indigenous communities would prefer not having non-Indigenous people working with them. They don't want non-Indigenous people to take up space which should be reserved for Indigenous peoples. So I am wondering, in terms of the relationship building, how should an immigrant go about building a working relationship beyond the superficial level and doing that respectfully?
Well, that's that's an important question. And one thing that participants in my research brought up is that there's like the TRC calls to action are already an amazing resource for organizations to draw on. And the final report of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report. So taking seriously the resources that are already out there to do some of that internal work. And I think, again, this might not be a satisfactory, satisfying answer, because I don't think that there is like one like silver bullet solution to building the relationships, but that sometimes it requires just showing up like over and over to events that are explicitly welcome or open to the public. Not all events are, and that's totally understandable, but there are many that do welcome the public. So, and people notice when you show up and find opportunities to help through real life conversations.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are some events that has to be intentionally closed off, because that's their space. And just like, racialized women might need some very specific place for us to, make sense of our experience, the same for any other groups. Um, and then I think there are like things like powwows that you could easily attend to and, keep showing up to those kind of like events. I found those events to be quite, entry point where you might be able to find possible connections. And just really showing up, like showing your face. I think that's quite important. Yeah, so that would be my response.
Thank you for answering the question. We're going to go ahead and do our final Q&A question. This is in the Q&A chat box. I'll go ahead and read it. Thank you for your presentation. I really learned a lot. I work with a grassroots organization that is volunteer run. We have led community conversations on settler violence in the language the group speaks. It was a start, but there is very little Indigenous representation the group I work with. It sees that it is harmful. For example, homelessness, intercommunal violence between youth, our community, and local Indigenous youth. How do you decrease these perceptions when these violence exists?
Um, I wonder if this question, like just again, just to understand it properly, is that are you saying like that there is a lot of literature or a language material, like the instruction materials kind of focus on the rather negative aspect of the experience?
I
And then
believe.
okay. Um, I think if you could draw on some Indigenous resurgency scholarship or some sort of materials, they have such a really beautiful writing about their Indigenous intelligence. Leanne Simpson, as I think that's the first person like comes mind to. Um, I think there is a lot of a beautiful aspect of their life that is that we can learn a lot from. So perhaps goes to Indigenous scholars and activists and even writers that speak about the beauty of the land, the land-based knowledge, land-based practices. I think I always tends to go back to the land-based stuff only because I think that's quite essential on their knowledge system. And I think, you might hold a conversation circle outside and to see like, kind of reflect on how those land has been stored by, your local Indigenous communities.
I think it's great that your organization is already leading community conversations on settler violence, and I think if there is an opportunity to expand that circle and include the Indigenous community members, especially if there is already interaction between the youth in both communities, there is. It does seem like there is an opening for building that relationship. So I know that it's really difficult work, and that's a lot of the narratives that I heard repeated from newcomers in Saskatoon. I know that there's some great examples of this kind of restorative work that's been done in Winnipeg um, after incidents of inter-community violence, which I can't think of off the top of my head, but I like Dr. Chizuru is saying, looking for those existing resources, I think would be a great start.
Thank you, Dr. Yukiko and Dr. Chizuru. I think that ends our Q&A session. On behalf of everyone, we thank Dr. Yukiko and Dr. Chizuru for the time that they took preparing the presentation today. We truly appreciate and value your knowledge and expertise. Thank you again to our speakers and to all of you for attending today's webinar. We hope this session inspired continued reflection, dialogue, and action in your communities. There is an evaluation link in the chat box. Please fill out the form as your feedback will guide our future webinars. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope you have a restful weekend. Take care.